Hi English 9 and English 9 Honors. This is a little review on how to fix some of the common errors in your research paper. I've gone through and looked at your rough drafts, and while I haven't gone through it and corrected everything, I've kind of narrowed down on some of the major components that you guys did really well on, but other things that you guys might need to work on for your final drafts. So we're going to go and talk about a little bit of things that you can do to improve your research paper for your final draft. So first thing that you might need to do is you're going to start with your self-revision, self-edit checklist. This paper, it's specific to English 9, which you'll see here, but also English 9 Honors. You have one for each of the classes. This is a yes or no checklist that will help you go through and make sure everything in your paper is ready to turn in for your final draft. I would suggest doing this first and foremost after we've gone through this presentation, so that way you know where to start in terms of improving your rough draft to your final draft. While it is easy, it's a yes or no. You could easily just circle yes or no and turn it in that way. However, its intention is to really help you, so please make sure that you take the time to do this before you turn in your final draft. Now, one of the big things I suggest doing when you've got to go in and improve your rough draft to your final draft is find this packet. This is the ICE packet we talked about in the beginning of this unit, where we talked about how to introduce a quotation, how to cite a quotation, and then how to explain it. For both classes, this is the best way to integrate outside sources into your paper. One of the biggest things that we needed to work on from our rough drafts to our final drafts is to include signal phrases in order to integrate the outside sources into our writing to help with our sentence fluency and help our writing flow. So if you found the letters IQ written on your paper, or you see me made a comment about signal phrases, I would suggest going back to this packet and looking over some of the common rules or suggestions for how to use signal phrases, as this is going to be a huge component in your final draft grading. So let's talk about some of these signal phrases that you can use. First off, you can use some of these if you're paraphrasing. You can also use them if you're quoting. You would just put quotation marks. However, these are great phrases to use if you are kind of summarizing or paraphrasing what an author has already said. Now, where X is listed, that's where you would put in either the name of the author, or if you don't have the author, I would put in the name of the publication of the journal, magazine, or newspaper that it came from. So here you could start by saying that X, whoever your author is, believes that, and then go ahead and give a paraphrasing of what they use. So if you just kind of throw something out there without even mentioning the author or where the information came from, besides your parenthetical citation, I would suggest to use some of these phrases. Again, all of these phrases can be found in your ICE packet on the last page. Here is another example of some signal phrases that you can use when introducing quotations. Same sort of system as we saw in the last slide, but this one is specific to quotes. When you see X, again, that's your author you would plug in. If you wanted to throw in the literary work that it came from while writing in the journal. Remember we said when in doubt, if you don't know what someone is, you might want to give them a particular title, a scholar, a philosopher, a critic, something that gives us some sort of introduction towards that author. So if you see the words who written next to an author, you need to give some sort of indication of what their role is in this particular issue. One of the great things to use in these signal phrases are introducing some popular ideas or opinions or common studies that people have seen. So if you're introducing statistics or standard views, you could use some of these phrases. Americans today tend to believe that many people assumed that recent studies show. So if you're looking at citing a statistic, but you don't necessarily want to bring up the author at that moment, I would suggest using some of these signal phrases, as these are great ways to integrate statistics or certain views into your paper that you would need to cite. Last but not least, one of the biggest things in going through and integrating outside sources is not just introducing them, not just citing them, but also following them up with an explanation of how does this particular outside source support your idea? How does it support your issue? How does it support your claim? So you can use these signal phrases following the outside sources in order to set up your explanations and kind of, help support your issue with what the outside source is presenting. So you could say, in other words, X believes. You would plug in the author there. In making this comment, X argues that. So you would be referring back to the comment that you just cited. These are great ways to integrate outside sources into your paper, which is one of the biggest things we are working on with this project, is not just throwing in the outside sources for the sake of having them, but having them there to back up your ideas, as really this is a paper about your ideas and the support that you can give them with expert sources. Now, let's talk about some ways that we can use some of these signal phrases effectively. So here's a little practice I want us to do, and of course I'm going to go over the answers, but just note, as you're going through, I'm going to put up some signal phrases, and you can tell me whether or not they're good or bad. So here's an example. One engineer who figures prominently in all accounts of the 1986 Challenger accident says NASA was, quote, absolutely relentless and Machiavellian about following procedures to the letter. And then the parenthetical citation says Vaughn 221. Is this a good way to use signal phrases, or is this a bad way to use signal phrases? You got it right. This is a good way to involve signal phrases. Now, we didn't necessarily introduce the author in the beginning because this quote wasn't from the author. It was from someone who was an engineer related to the Challenger accident. However, here we put in the author at the end. This is totally fine. Remember, when you go to put in a signal phrase, you're putting either the author or the first word of the title and the page number. Here's another example for you. Take a second, read through it. Is this a good or bad way of integrating a signal phrase? If you guess bad, you are correct. Now, while you've introduced your author, you've given way too much identifying information. At this point, you're kind of just putting in filler. You can mention that she's a professor of psychology, but you don't have to tell me all of the credentials that she has. And then you don't have to introduce in that book on page 221. You can do that in your parenthetical citation. Plus, you're even missing a parenthetical citation here. So let's look at it from this stance. Professor Diane Vaughn cites a shuttle engineer who says NASA was absolutely relentless and Machiavellian about following procedures to the letter. What do you think here? If you guess good, you are correct. So notice we've integrated our author into the beginning, and we've identified who she is. And then since we've used her name in the sentence, we would only have to include the page number in the parentheses. If we don't have a page number, I would still like us to include the author's last name in the parentheses. However, just in case, this is a good way to go about it. Now, which is better? Looking at the first bullet or the second bullet, which one do you think would be the better way of using signal phrases in your paper? If you guess the bottom one, you are correct. While it is a little more writing than the first one, you'll notice the first one does not have a signal phrase. In this paper, I would have written IQ. They do not have any way of introducing this. Down the bottom, they say according to, according to Dr. Boyd, who is the director of cancer screening, he gives up some ideas that go along with this. It tells us what the quote is talking about. Here's something here. Is this a good or bad example of using signal phrases? If you said bad, you are correct. Notice the example itself was giving you a hint. Notice this is an example of a dropped quotation. It doesn't have any connection to the next sentence. There's no transition. There's nothing to help it explain of how it fits in your paper. They haven't even brought up who the author is. We have no clue. We don't know if he's qualified. You always want to go through and identify with a signal phrase how to connect this piece of outside source to your own writing. Here's another example for you. You'll notice that this is a good example of integrating signal phrases. While we bring up the author Patrick Brennan in the beginning, we don't bring him up really in the end. We don't have to talk about who he is because we've already talked about his credentials once. So at the first mention, it's okay to integrate using that signal phrase with the author's credentials, but anytime later in the paper that you bring up the same author, You want to avoid those drop quotes, but you also want to make sure that you're not over introducing them again. You can simply just use the author's last name. Last but not least, if we were wrapping up our paper or we were wrapping up an idea, which one would be better? Remember, we want to avoid first and second person in our paper. We want to stick with third person. So our best answer would be the second bullet. You want to make sure that even though this paper does have your own opinions, it does have some of the information that you know, we're making sure that we have this, generalized voice. We want to present this as an academic piece of writing, so therefore we don't want to include I, me, my, you, yeah, your, all those kinds of first and second person pronouns. Now let's talk about a couple other things that you might notice in your paper. So looking through your comments, notice you might see some things. First off, if I circled something and wrote MLA formatting, that means you need to look back to your paper and make sure that you've gotten your particular heading, that you've gotten your date correct, that you have the correct margins, that you have indents. Most of you did fine on this. I would just double check your date. That seemed to be the biggest problem. Another thing that you might need to check up on is using topic and conclusion sentences in your body paragraphs, and also using transitions. A lot of you have started your paragraphs and just go into what it is you're talking about, but you really haven't set up what the paragraph's going to be about. So if you're talking about the types of bullying, maybe give me a topic sentence that introduces the different types of bullying. If you're talking about smartphones being a distraction to drivers, maybe you need to introduce that within your topic sentence, and also wrap up at the end and conclude. Make sure you use your transitions worksheet to help integrate transitions to move to the next different supports that you're bringing up. We just talked about IQ, but IQ is one of the biggest things in your paper. If you didn't see specifically IQ, which meant introduce your quotes, you might have seen me mention a note about signal phrases. Just make sure you're including them in there. Another thing you might have seen around your quotations or your signal phrases is the word who. That means introduce them. Who are these people? What are their credentials? You don't have to give too many. You don't have to state their entire book. You could just say author, you could say scholar, you could say writer, or if you don't have an author, just say the periodical that came from, the journal, newspaper, or magazine title. Make sure you check your punctuation. I went through and for the most part corrected everybody's punctuation for their parenthetical citations. But remember, your punctuation does not go here, it goes at the end. It's at the end of the sentence. If you have a citation that's circled and it says format to WC, that means you've probably written something that is not exactly how it appears on your works cited page. So you need to look back at the works cited page and look at the first character written for each citation. So here's an example for you. If I was in this paper, actually let me go to my next one, and you see here, I would actually circle this and I would write format to WC. So what that means is Monique would actually have to go down to her works cited page and look. Notice the word working here is written in quotation marks. That means she actually has to make her paper, her parenthetical citations in her paper, fit with how they're formatted on the works cited page. So she would have to put in quotation marks. So if you have format to WC, make sure you check your citations on your works cited page. If I circled something and wrote not in WC, that means you've cited something in your paper that's not listed on your works cited page and you need to add it in there. A lot of you also cited things in your works cited page that aren't in your paper. Make sure you delete those. One of the biggest things to check is make sure your thesis is in the order of your controls. Your paper is in the order of your thesis controls. So that way if you talk about causes before types, or you talk about distracted driving before education distractions, make sure that your paragraphs go in order of that. Some other things to think about is this is the explanation part of the ICE, integrate, quote, explain. This is that big follow-up to the outside sources. You want to make sure that you're always reinforcing your thesis. How is this an issue? Or how is this a negative or positive impact on teens? You always want to bring it back to this. I should see multiple sentences of your own writing after each of the outside sources to make sure that you are developing this paper and the outside sources are there as support. For English 9, you want to make sure that you're hitting a full 3 pages. If you are in English 9 Honors, remember you're hitting a full 4 pages, meaning there should be a line on the 5th page. Check out the specifics on your checklist to make sure that you have them right. You also need 5 different outside sources actually cited in your paper. You need 1 book, 1 approved website, and 2 database articles at least. If you don't have 5 outside sources in your paper, you need to add them in for your final draft. If something is circled and it says format or it says check, that could be either in your paper or in your works cited page, please make sure that you're checking the formatted of your information. Remember, Noodle Tools is only as good as what you type into it. So if you haven't capitalized things appropriately, it's not going to be correct. If you spelled things wrong, go back to the original source and make sure you cited it correctly. That's one of the things that we just mentioned is formatting is a big grade for your works cited page. Make sure you have your hanging indents. Make sure that everything is alphabetized by the last name of the author or the first word of the title. If you want me to look at it, please make sure that you come and see me. One of the biggest things that you need to do is run grammar and spelling check. For this rough draft, I did not go through and correct all of your grammar, all of your sentence fluency, everything that you need for your writing to flow effectively. So what you need to do at the minimum is go through and run grammar and spelling check as a tool to help you. You'll notice some of these remarks written throughout your paper, just in case you see them. This is some of the details of how you can improve some of these things. I really didn't go through and do much of the grammar. However, you'll notice if I put a slash in between 2 characters, that means insert a space. If I put a slash through the letter, that means lowercase a letter. If I put 3 lines under a letter, that means to capitalize it. You'll see the paragraph symbol sometimes in there. You'll see something circled. If I wrote word choice, that means you might want to change the words that you use, comma splice, run on. You want to make sure to avoid all these things. However, recognize I did not correct everything for you. If you want to sit down and have me go through all of the grammar in your paper, please make sure that you come and see me as soon as possible so we can go through and go through those errors together. Otherwise, it's going to be on you to correct this information. Now, when you think that you're totally done, when you've gone through and actually edited your paper, you have your 5 sources, you've integrated with signal phrases, you want to make sure that you go into Google and download to Microsoft Word in order to have the spelling and grammar check. Unfortunately, Google only provides the spelling check. They don't do the grammar check. So what you want to make sure to do is go up to File, Download As, and then Microsoft Word. So just in case you need to see that, if you're in your paper, you're going to need to go up to File, Download As, and click on Microsoft Word. And what that'll do is pop up a little pop-up. Now it's going to look different on my computer because I'm using a Mac. If you're using the school computer, you're going to actually have your little toolbar up here, and it will say Review, and you're going to click on that and hit Spelling and Grammar. For mine, I can click Spelling and Grammar from Tools since I'm on the Mac. And what I'm going to do is go through and ignore any of the suggestions that it's giving me, or if I want to change it, I should change it. Notice it's giving me a little bit of error because it's saying I have too many spaces, so I'm going to click change. Same thing here. So I'm going to go through and notice one of the biggest things I could do after I've gone through and done all my spelling and grammar check is go up to Edit, Find and Replace, and I want to make sure that I get rid of all of my first and second person pronouns. So if I'm doing that in this paper, notice if I can do that here, or I can actually do that back in Google. If I go up to Edit, Find, and Replace, and I typed in you, and I wanted to get rid of all my first and second person pronouns, notice it'll find all of them and correct them for me. So I could just say replace with Imagine Teens, and I could make replace, and it will do that. However, you want to make sure that you do it based on individual status. For right now, like, it wouldn't make sense to put teens. So I might have to put something else to correct that. One of the biggest things you want to look for in your paper, and using that checklist will help you go through and figure out all that stuff. So make sure after you've downloaded your paper in Microsoft Word, you've run grammar and spelling check, you want to then make sure to copy and paste your paper back into Google. Make sure you check the indents, make sure you check your paragraph formatting, make sure everything looks okay.